Josephine Callaway burned her father's last letter with steady hands and a breaking heart. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere between Boston and the Wyoming territory line. All she had left was a one-way ticket, a carpet bag, and a promise she'd made to herself that no man would ever choose her life for her again. But the moment she stepped off that train into the blazing summer heat of Laram, Wyoming, she had no idea that the one person standing between her and everything falling apart would be a stranger with dust on his boots and something dangerous in his eyes. If this story moves, you hit that subscribe button and follow Josephine all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The train station at Laram, Wyoming smelled like coal smoke and dry earth, and something Josephine Callaway couldn't quite name, freedom maybe, or the terrifying shape of it. She stepped onto the platform, and the summer heat hit her like a wall. Back in Boston, summer was carriages and parasols and the smell of salt water off the harbor. This was something else entirely. The sky above Laram stretched so wide and so blue it made her chest ache, and the town spread out before her like something rough-hewn from the land itself. Nothing polished, nothing gentle. She straightened her spine. She'd chosen this. She'd chosen it when she'd walked away from a dining room table where her father sat with a man named Arthur Pennington, 43 years old, tobacco-stained teeth, and a family name her father wanted attached to the Callaway fortune. She'd chosen it when she'd folded that introduction letter from the Laram school board into her bodice and said nothing to anyone, just packed what she could carry and left before the sun came up. She was 20 years old. She wasn't going to spend the rest of her life being a transaction. The platform was busy for such a small town. Men moved crates and barrels. A woman in a sun-faded dress argued with a station master over a package. Two boys chased each other between the legs of travelers, and nobody seemed to notice that Josephine had arrived. That suited her fine. She picked up her carpet bag and started toward the edge of the platform, consulting the letter in her hand. The schoolhouse was on the north end of Main Street, according to the address. She needed to find the chairman of the school board, a Mr. Harold Greer, who'd written back to her application with stiff formality and the offer of $30 a month and a room above the dry goods store. $30 a month. Her own room. Her own name on a roster. She'd read that letter so many times the creases had gone soft. "You lost, miss?" She stopped. The voice came from just off to her left. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself to be heard and didn't need to. She turned. The man leaning against the corner post of the station was tall, with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a long time outdoors and learned patience from the land itself. His hat was pulled low against the sun. His shirt was the color of dust. His arms were crossed, and he was watching her with a direct, unhurried gaze that was neither rude nor polite, just honest. "I'm not lost," Josephine said. "I know exactly where I'm going." He tilted his head. "Station's been letting off passengers all morning. You're the only one still standing on the platform, holding a letter like it's a map to buried treasure." She folded the letter and put it in her bag. "I was orienting myself." To Laram. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Ain't a lot to orient to." "Then I won't need long." She met his eyes directly, the way her mother had told her never to meet a strange man's eyes, and said, "Is the schoolhouse north on Main Street or south?" He pushed off the post. He was taller, standing straight. "North. About 4 blocks. Stone building with a bell on the roof that hasn't rung since Thomas Greer broke the rope last spring." Thomas Greer. Any relation to Harold Greer? His boy. 10 years old and more trouble than a spring colt. He reached down and picked up her second bag, the one she'd set down to find the letter, and held it out to her without being asked. Not taking it from her. Just lifting it so she didn't have to bend for it. There was a difference, and she noticed it. "Vaughn Daniels," he said. She took the bag. "Josephine Callaway." "You the new school teacher?" "I am." He nodded, something settling in his expression. Town's been waiting on one. Last one left in February. Said the winters were too hard. I grew up in Boston, Josephine said. I know something about hard winters. This ain't Boston winters, Miss Callaway. No, she agreed, looking out at the wide, sun-hammered street, the open sky, the mountains in the far distance like a painting of themselves. It's not. That's rather the point. He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. Not in the way Arthur Pennington had looked at her, measuring her, pricing her, calculating the return. Vaughn Daniels looked at her the way a man looks at something that surprises him. Then he tipped his hat. Welcome to Laram. She watched him walk away, and then she picked up her bags and went to find Harold Greer. Harold Greer was a short, broad man with a large desk and a larger opinion of himself. His office was attached to the feed store he owned, and the smell of grain and leather hung in the air between them, while he looked at her over his glasses with an expression she recognized immediately. Doubt. Miss Callaway, he said, leaning back in his chair. I'll admit, your letter was impressive. Your credentials from the teaching college, your references. But, she said. He blinked. Pardon. You were about to say but, Mr. Greer. I've been in enough rooms with men about to say but, to recognize the pause. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I was going to say, he continued carefully, that when we wrote to you, we hadn't anticipated, that is to say, some members of the board had concerns. About what? About a young woman, unmarried, living alone above Caldwell's store and teaching the children of Laram without a male authority in the household. Josephine set her bag down on the chair beside her and sat in the other one, smoothing her skirt, taking her time about it. She'd learned that from her mother, that sometimes the best answer to a fool was to make him wait for it. Mr. Greer, she said, you wrote to me. You offered me this position. You sent me a contract with your name on it, and the school board seal. I did. Then the question of whether I'm suitable was settled when you posted that letter. She held his gaze. Unless you'd like to explain to 30 families why their children won't have a teacher this fall because of concerns that weren't concerns enough to stop you from recruiting me. A long pause. The room above Caldwell's is small, he said finally. I'll manage. Another pause. He picked up a pen, set it down. You understand the salary is $30 a month. I understood that in March, Mr. Greer, when I signed my half of the contract. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then something shifted in him. Not warmth exactly, but the particular resignation of a man who recognizes when he's been outmaneuvered by someone he underestimated. School starts in 3 weeks, he said. I'll have someone show you the schoolhouse. I can find it myself, Josephine said, and picked up her bag. The room above Caldwell's dry goods was exactly as small as Harold Greer had implied, and exactly what Josephine needed. One window facing the street, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a writing desk. She stood in the center of it and breathed. No one in this room was deciding her future. She pressed her hands together, looked at the ceiling, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt something that might have been peace. Then someone knocked on the door. She opened it. A woman stood on the landing, maybe 40, with red-brown hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that had been pretty once and was interesting now. She was holding a covered dish. Clara Holt, the woman said. I run the laundry on 2nd Street. Martha Caldwell told me you'd arrived, and I figured you hadn't had a hot meal since... She looked Josephine over with frank, appraising eyes. Since somewhere east of here. Josephine Callaway. Josephine stepped back to let her in. And you're right, the train was not generous with its dining arrangements. Clara set the dish on the writing desk and pulled the cloth off it. Cornbread and stewed beef still steaming. Laram's a small town, she said without apology. Everybody knows everybody's business before they've had time to make any. Some of the women on the board wives will be cool with you, Don't take it personally. Why would they be cool with me? Clara sat down on the edge of the bed as if she'd been invited, which she hadn't, but Josephine found she didn't mind. Because their husbands were the ones writing to teaching colleges, and they know it. A young, unmarried woman rolls into town with good posture and a Boston address. She spread her hands. Human nature. Josephine sat at the desk and picked up a fork. I'm not here to threaten anyone's marriage. I know that. You know that. Clara tilted her head. Give it time. Who'd you run into at the station? The question was casual. Too casual. A man named Vaughn Daniels, Josephine said. Clara's expression didn't change, but something moved through it, a flicker of something that Josephine couldn't read. He helped you with your bags. He offered. I managed. Clara smoothed her skirt. Vaughn's a decent man. Runs the Double D spread northeast of town. His father built it. He's kept it going through 2 droughts and 1 bad winter that took half the cattle in this county. She paused. He doesn't bother people who don't want bothering, and he doesn't leave people stranded who need a hand. He seemed straightforward, Josephine said. He is. Clara stood. That's either a virtue or a complication depending on the week. Josephine looked at her. Why would straightforwardness be a complication? Clara smiled for the first time, genuine, knowing a little wry. Because straightforward men have a way of making everything else feel crooked by comparison. She headed for the door. Eat that before it goes cold. And Miss Callaway... She paused with her hand on the frame. You held your own with Harold Greer. Word travels fast in a small town. That's a good first step. She was gone before Josephine could ask how she already knew about that. The schoolhouse needed work. Josephine discovered this the morning after her arrival, when she walked its length from door to back wall and made a list in her notebook. 3 windows with cracked panes. A wood stove with a warped door. Desks in various states of splinter. A blackboard so chalked over it had gone permanently gray. She was on her knees checking the floorboards under the first row of desks. Several were soft water damaged, would need to be replaced before a child put a foot through one when the door opened behind her. School doesn't start for 3 weeks, she said without turning around. She'd heard boots on the step. Whoever it was hadn't knocked. I know. Vaughn Daniels' voice. Greer sent me. Said the building needed looking at before you moved furniture. She sat back on her heels and turned. He was standing just inside the door, hat in hand, this time looking at the ceiling joists with a professional eye. He sent a rancher to assess a schoolhouse, she said. I do repair work in the summers, slower season. He walked toward the window without asking permission, pressed on the sill, checked the frame. This one's rotted through. Window will need to come out and the frame rebuilt. I know. I made a list. She stood brushing dust from her skirt. I can share it with you if that would help. He turned and looked at her. In the summer light coming through the cracked glass, she could see his face more clearly than she had at the station, mid-30s, she guessed, with lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, and a jaw that looked like it was accustomed to clenching when he was thinking hard. I'd appreciate that, he said. She tore the page from her notebook and held it out. He crossed to her and took it, and she noticed his hands broad-scarred across the knuckles, completely at ease. He read down her list without any visible reaction, and then he looked up. You found the soft floors, he said. I was thorough. Most people just look at the surface. Most people aren't responsible for 20 children standing on those floors all winter, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not one either. He folded her list and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll start on the windows tomorrow. The floors will take a few days. I'll need to pull the boards and check the joists underneath. Might be worse than it looks. It usually is, Josephine said, and then wasn't sure whether she meant the floors or something else. He looked at her for a moment. You got someone helping you move furniture. I'll manage. That seems to be your answer to most things. Is that a criticism? No, ma'am. He turned toward the door. It's an observation. She watched him leave and stood in the dusty, sun-bright schoolhouse, with the list missing from her notebook and an odd sensation in her chest that she deliberately did not examine. She'd been in Laram 6 days when she heard the rumors. She was at the general store buying chalk and a new notebook when she became aware of the conversation happening in the dry goods aisle just around the corner from where she stood. 2 women, voices low, not low enough. Can't imagine what Harold was thinking bringing a girl like that out here. Boston family, they say. Ran off? That's what Ruth told me. The father had a match arranged and she just left. A pause. Then, well, that explains certain things. Doesn't it, though? A woman who'd walk out on her own father's arrangement? You can imagine what kind of woman she is. I can imagine exactly. Josephine put down the chalk she was holding. She picked it back up. She paid for her things without looking at either woman, without letting her hands shake, without letting anything show in her face. She walked out into the summer heat and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. She was not going to cry in the street. She was not going to go back inside and say things she'd regret. She was not going to let Laram, Wyoming break her in the first week. She was going to walk back to her room, have a glass of water, and tomorrow she was going to stand at the front of that schoolhouse and teach, and she was going to do it well, and none of this was going to matter. Miss Callaway. She turned. Vaughn Daniels was standing 10 feet away on the boardwalk, tools in hand, clearly just come from the direction of the schoolhouse. He looked at her face and went very still. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. Automatic. Practiced. He looked at her for a moment, that same direct, unhurried look he'd had at the station, not pushing, just present. "You sure about that, Mr. Daniels? You heard something," he said. Not a question. His jaw had gone to that particular angle she was starting to recognize the clenching while thinking line. "In the store." She looked at him. "How would you know that?" "Because you came out of there looking like someone who wants very badly to keep her composure and isn't sure how much longer she can manage it." He set his tools down on the railing. Deliberate. Unhurried. "And because Laram is a small town, and there are exactly 2 women who use that store on Thursday mornings, and I know what they do with their time." Josephine looked down the street. "It doesn't matter." "It matters, or it wouldn't be on your face." "Mr. Daniels." "Vaughn." She stopped. "You're going to be here a while," he said simply. "If you're going to be telling me it doesn't matter every few weeks, you might as well use my name." She looked at him. The sun was brutal overhead, and the street was loud with wagon traffic, and somewhere down the block, a horse was making its displeasure known loudly and persistently, and Vaughn Daniels stood there on the boardwalk with his tools and his steady gaze, and didn't look away. "They think I'm ruined," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Because I left Boston, because I didn't do what my father wanted." He picked up his tools. He didn't offer condolences or denials or hollow reassurances, and she was grateful for that in a way she couldn't have explained. "Well," he said, "far as I can tell, you got yourself to Laram, you held your ground with Harold Greer, and you found the soft floorboards before I did." He looked at her one more time. "Doesn't sound much like ruin to me." He walked off down the street. Josephine stood there on the boardwalk in the summer heat of Wyoming, and something in her chest. Something she'd been holding tight and braced since the moment she'd stepped off that train, let go just slightly. Just enough. She was going to be all right. She was sure of it, standing there in the heat, watching the dust settle behind Vaughn Daniels' boots. What she wasn't sure of, what she couldn't have known not yet, was that somewhere back in Boston, a man with a letter of legal authority and her father's blessing was already boarding a westbound train, and he had only one destination in mind. Her. School started on a Monday, and by Wednesday, Josephine Callaway knew every child's name, every child's weakness, and exactly which ones were going to test her before the month was out. Thomas Greer was exactly what Vaughn had promised, a 10-year-old storm system in suspenders, with his father's broad face, and considerably less of his father's caution. He'd arrived on the first day with a frog in his coat pocket and the expression of a boy who expected to be underestimated. Josephine had confiscated the frog, named it formally in front of the class, as Professor Greenback placed it in a jar on her desk, and told Thomas that since he'd brought them a class pet, he was now responsible for its care, and could present a 2-minute report on frog biology by Friday. Thomas had stared at her. "Close your mouth, Thomas," she'd said pleasantly. "A gentleman doesn't gape." He'd closed his mouth. He'd also delivered the most earnest 2-minute presentation she'd ever witnessed from a 10-year-old, and somewhere in the middle of it, while he explained the difference between tree frogs and bullfrogs, with the focused gravity of a tiny professor, Josephine had felt something warm and certain settle into her chest. She was supposed to be here. Whatever else was true, whatever was on that westbound train, whatever her father was saying about her to men like Arthur Pennington, this was true too. These children needed someone who wasn't going to leave in February, and she was not leaving in February. She told herself that firmly every morning while she walked to the schoolhouse, and she almost entirely believed it. Vaughn finished the windows by the end of the first week. He worked early before the children arrived, and she'd come in on Thursday morning to find the first new frame already set the glass clean and uncracked the sill rebuilt so solid she could press her whole weight against it and feel nothing give. She ran her hand along the wood without thinking about it the way you touch something that's been mended well. "It'll hold," said a voice from the doorway. She didn't startle. She was getting used to the way he moved or didn't move, which was more accurate. Vaughn Daniels had a stillness to him that most men she'd known didn't have. Men in Boston fidgeted. They checked their watches. They filled silence with their own importance. He just stood there and let the silence be whatever it was. "I wasn't worried," she said. "Yes, you were." He came in and looked at the second window. "You were checking to see if it would hold weight. That's not admiration, that's a structural test." She felt the corner of her mouth betray her. It was both. He crouched to look at the lower corner of the frame pressed on something with his thumb. "These kids giving you trouble. They're giving me everything they've got," she said, "which is what I asked for." He looked up at her. "Thomas Greer put a frog on your desk yet?" "He put one in his pocket. I promoted it to faculty." A pause. Then for the first time she heard him actually laugh, not the almost smile she'd catalogued over the past week, but a real sound, brief and low, like something that surprised him on the way out. It did something unexpected to the air in the room. "His daddy's not going to know what to do with that boy," Vaughn said. "His daddy should try listening to him," she said. "Thomas knows more about this county's wildlife than half the adults in it. He's not trouble. He's just smarter than the room usually gives him credit for." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. He stood and dusted his hands on his pants. "You been here 2 weeks?" "Yes." "And you've already figured out Thomas Greer?" "I pay attention to people," she said simply. He looked at her with that direct, considering gaze. "I noticed," he said. The moment stretched just a beat too long, and then he picked up his tools and said he'd have the second window done by noon, and Josephine turned back to her lesson plans and told herself the warmth in her face was the morning sun through the new glass. It wasn't. The letter arrived on a Saturday. It came addressed to Miss Josephine Callaway in her father's handwriting, which she recognized the way you recognize a sound that's preceded pain before immediately, and in the body before the mind catches up. She was at the dry goods store buying ink when Martha Caldwell handed it across the counter with the careful expression of a woman who knew what long-distance letters from Boston meant. She didn't open it in the store. She walked back to her room, sat at the writing desk, and opened it with steady hands. Her father's letters had a structure she'd memorized in childhood. Formal opening. The business of concern. The closing that was never warm but always signed with his full name, as though she might forget who he was. This one broke the structure. "You have embarrassed this family in a manner I cannot forgive. Arthur Pennington is a patient man and a generous one. And what you have done to his regard for this family is not something I will speak of in a letter. I have been in contact with Mr. Pennington, and I will tell you only this. The matter is not settled simply because you have chosen to run. You are still a Callaway. That carries obligations that geography cannot erase. She read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases, put it back in its envelope, and placed it in the bottom of her trunk under her winter shawl. She sat for a long time at the writing desk without writing anything. The matter is not settled. She didn't know what that meant exactly. She knew what it felt like, a hand closing around something she'd almost managed to hold free. She knew the shape of it. She'd grown up inside that shape. She was still sitting there when Clara Holt knocked on her door 1 story below, and 3 knocks of her particular rhythm. Josephine went down and opened the door. Clara took 1 look at her face and said, "I'm making coffee. Come." Clara's house was 2 streets over and smelled like starch and dried lavender and something baking. She didn't ask questions while the coffee was brewing. She put a cup in front of Josephine and sat across the table and waited. And that was the thing about Clara. She had the gift of useful silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but wasn't crowding you either. "My father wrote," Josephine said. "I figured it was something like that. He says—" She stopped. Tried again. "He says the man he wanted me to marry is still, that the situation isn't resolved just because I left." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "What kind of man is he?" "The one your father chose." 43. Wealthy. He was kind enough at dinner when it was still just a social call. She looked at the table. "And then I overheard him and my father discussing the terms. What he would receive in exchange for the marriage. What my father would receive." She paused. "I wasn't in the room for that conversation. I was a commodity being discussed in my absence in my own home." "Lord," Clara said quietly, "he's not a violent man. He wouldn't have been cruel, I don't think." Josephine looked up. "But I would have spent 30 years watching him make decisions about my life while I stood 2 feet away and had no vote in any of it. And that—" Her voice caught just briefly. She steadied it. "That felt like a kind of violence, too." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Does Vaughn know?" The question landed oddly. Josephine blinked. "Why would Vaughn need to know?" Clara looked at her with a patience that was just slightly weighted. "Because if a man from Boston shows up in Laram looking for an unmarried young woman, Vaughn Daniels is one of about 4 people in this town who would actually do something useful about it." "I don't need." "Josephine." Clara's voice was gentle, but it didn't move. "Needing help and being capable aren't opposites. You can be the strongest woman in Wyoming territory and still let someone stand beside you." Josephine looked at her coffee. She didn't say anything, but she didn't argue either. She was back at the schoolhouse on Monday before the children arrived, chalking the day's arithmetic on the gray board, when she heard the door and assumed it was Thomas Greer arriving early to check on Professor Greenback. "He ate his flies this morning," she said without turning. "He's fine." "I don't know who that is," said Vaughn's voice, "but I'm glad he's doing well." She turned. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the considering look, not the almost smile, something more direct than either. "Greer asked me to fix the stovepipe before the cold sets in," he said. "But that's not why I came." She set down the chalk. "All right." "Clara Holt talked to me." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Clara Holt talks to everyone." "She does." He came in a few steps. "She told me about the letter, about the man in Boston." He stopped. "I'm not here to make assumptions about your situation or tell you what to do about it. I just want you to know." He paused, jaw working in that way she recognized. "If someone shows up in Laram looking for you in a way that you don't want, you tell me." "Mr. Daniels?" "Vaughn?" "Vaughn?" She pressed her hands together. I am not your responsibility. I know that. His voice was even. I didn't say you were. I said you should tell me. He held her gaze. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun was coming through the new windows, his work clean and solid and done right, and the schoolroom was quiet, the way it only was before the children arrived, full of the particular potential of empty desks. Why? She said. He seemed to think about it, really think about it, not reach for something easy. Because you're doing something hard, he said finally. And you're doing it right, and I've got no patience for people who try to undo that. She didn't know what to say to that. He didn't seem to require her to say anything. He put his hat back on and went to look at the stovepipe, and she picked up her chalk and went back to the arithmetic. But her hand wasn't quite steady on the board, and she was glad she was facing away from him. The harvest social came at the end of September, when the summer had finally begun to release its grip, and the evenings carried the first real edge of the coming cold. The whole town turned out. It was that kind of event, obligatory, and anticipated in equal measure, held in the barn behind the feed store, with fiddles and pie, and the particular social combustion of a small community that hadn't had a reason to gather in months. Josephine went because Clara told her it would be worse to stay home, and because she'd been in Laram long enough now that staying home would read as a statement, and she didn't want to make statements. She wanted to teach school and live quietly, and have that be enough. She wore her blue dress, which was the best thing she'd brought from Boston, that didn't look like Boston, and she stood near the pie table talking to Ruth Hadley, the blacksmith's wife, who had turned out to be considerably less hostile than Josephine had initially expected, and considerably more funny once you got past her reserve. That's Martha Greer giving you the eye from across the barn, Ruth said, not looking in that direction. She's decided you're a civilizing influence on Thomas, and she doesn't know whether to thank you or resent you for it. Tell her she can do both, Josephine said. I find people often do. Ruth laughed, genuine and uncomplicated, and Josephine thought not for the first time that she was building something here. Not just a teaching position, something that felt like a life. Then Vaughn Daniels walked into the barn, and Ruth Hadley stopped talking mid-sentence. Not because of anything dramatic, just because he had that quality of presence that didn't announce itself loudly but rearranged the room anyway. He'd cleaned up. His shirt was dark and his hat was better than the work one, and he stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment, looking around with that patient, unhurried survey. His eyes found her the way she was starting to expect they would. Directly. He crossed to her, nodded to Ruth. Evening? Vaughn, Ruth said, and then quite suddenly remembered she needed to speak to someone on the other side of the barn. He looked at the space where Ruth had been. Did I interrupt something? She's tactful, Josephine said. After a fashion. He reached past her for a cup of cider from the table, and for a moment he was close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used, Pine Clean Simple, nothing like the bay rum and pipe tobacco of Boston men, and she had the disorienting sensation of her own pulse doing something unscheduled. You look like you're deciding whether you're glad you came, he said. I'm glad I came, she said, which was more honest than she'd intended. He turned to look at her. Yeah. Ruth Hadley is funnier than I expected. The pie is exceptional. And... She stopped. And... She looked at him. He was watching her with the same attention he gave to everything, complete and unrushed, and without agenda, as far as she could tell. And Laram is starting to feel like somewhere I want to be, she said quietly. Which I didn't expect. Not this fast. Something moved in his expression. Something that wasn't the almost smile, and wasn't the professional consideration. Something that was quieter than both, and went deeper. Josephine, he said. Not Miss Callaway, just her name. In his voice, which was low and level and not given to carelessness. Will you dance with me? She looked at him. The fiddles had started something slow, and couples were moving toward the center of the barn, and she knew with the clarity of a woman who was 20 years old and finally paying attention to herself that if she said yes to this dance, she was saying yes to something larger than a dance. "Yes," she said. His hand found hers. And that was the moment, not when she'd stepped off the train, not when she'd stood her ground with Harold Greer, not even when she'd read her father's letter with steady hands. That was the moment Josephine Callaway understood she'd changed her life in a way that was real and irreversible and entirely completely her own. They danced. And somewhere outside under a sky full of stars, she was still learning the names of a man named Arthur Pennington, stepped off a westbound train at the Laram station, adjusted his coat, and looked down the main street of the town with the focused, unhurried patience of someone who was used to getting what he considered already his. He'd brought a letter. It had her father's name on it and a lawyer's seal, and it said things that Josephine Callaway hadn't read yet. Things that were about to make every choice she'd made feel suddenly dangerously fragile. Arthur Pennington made his presence known the way men like him always did, not loudly but thoroughly, like water, finding every crack in a foundation before anyone noticed the damage had begun. He was at the hotel on First Street by the time the harvest social ended. By morning, he'd had breakfast with Harold Greer. By noon, Harold Greer's wife had told Martha Greer. By the time Josephine walked to the schoolhouse on Tuesday, she could feel it, that particular shift in the air of a small town that has acquired new information and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. Ruth Hadley caught her on the boardwalk. "There's a man from Boston at the hotel," Ruth said, quiet and direct, the way Ruth did everything. "Been asking questions about you. How long you've been here, whether you're settled, whether there's anyone—" She paused deliberately. "Anyone close?" Josephine's hands were at her sides, and she made herself keep walking. "What did people tell him?" "Depends on who he asked." Ruth matched her pace. "Some of this town would hand him a map to your door with a bow on it. Some wouldn't say a word." She looked sideways at Josephine. "Vaughn knows. Clara told him this morning." "Clara Holt," Josephine said quietly, "is going to give me a heart condition before winter." "Clara Holt," Ruth said, "loves you in her way, and she's not wrong to tell him." Josephine stopped walking. She stood on the boardwalk with the morning sun hitting her square in the face and thought about the letter still buried in her trunk and the legal seal Clara had described, and the particular patient way Arthur Pennington had looked at her across her father's dining room table, like a problem he'd already solved and just hadn't announced yet. "He has a lawyer's document," she said. That's what Clara said. "A document doesn't mean anything. I'm not a piece of property. I'm a grown woman with a contract of employment and a legal right to be wherever I choose to be." "I know that," Ruth said. "You know that." She looked at her steadily. "Does he?" Josephine went to the schoolhouse and taught every lesson she had planned and did not let her hands shake on the chalk once. She was exceptional at this. She'd had 20 years of practice not letting things show. Thomas Greer stayed after the other children left, ostensibly to feed Professor Greenback, actually to sit on top of his desk and look at her with his father's broad face and a child's unfiltered perceptiveness. "Miss Callaway," he said, "how come you look the same as always, but different?" "I look exactly the same, Thomas." "No, you don't. You look the same on the outside." He swung his legs. "My mama gets like that when something's wrong, and she doesn't want us to know." Josephine looked at him. 10 years old, smarter than the room. "Feed the frog," she said gently, "and go home." He did, but he looked back at her from the doorway with an expression that was more adult than it had any right to be. She was locking the schoolhouse when she heard the footsteps. Not Vaughn's. Vaughn moved with that particular quiet. These footsteps were deliberate, measured the walk of a man who expected the ground to receive him accordingly. She turned. Arthur Pennington was exactly as she remembered, 60 years old or thereabouts, with silver at his temples and a well-cut coat that was too fine for a Wyoming street, and which he wore anyway because it had never occurred to him to dress for anyone else's comfort. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. He stopped 10 feet from her and smiled. "Josephine," he said, "you look well." "Mr. Pennington." Her voice was even. 20 years of practice. You've come a long way. You left quite suddenly. He tilted his head, pleasant and absolutely immovable. Your father was worried. My father was embarrassed, she said. There's a difference. Something shifted behind his eyes. Just slightly. You were always direct. I respected that about you. Then I'll be direct now. She faced him full on, the schoolhouse key in her hand. Whatever document you're carrying, whatever arrangement you and my father have made, I am not party to it. I didn't sign anything. I don't intend to. He reached into his coat and produced the envelope she'd expected. Set it against his palm like a card he'd been holding for the right moment. Your father signed on your behalf. You were a minor when the initial agreement was reached. I'm not a minor now. No. He looked at her. But the agreement involved a financial arrangement between our families that has already been partially executed. Your father received consideration. He paused, letting that land. Money, Josephine. Already paid. She felt it hit her the way she'd been afraid it would not surprise exactly, but the cold, sickening confirmation of something she'd suspected and hadn't let herself look at directly. Her father had already taken the money. The sale had already been made. She'd run from a transaction that was legally, financially already complete. That's between you and my father, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. A court might disagree. He tucked the envelope away. I haven't come to threaten you, Josephine. I want you to understand that. I've come because there's a reasonable solution available, and I'd rather find it than pursue the alternative. And what's the reasonable solution? Come back to Boston. Fulfill the arrangement. Your father keeps what he's already received. You return to a life that is, he spread his hands, considerably more comfortable than this. She looked at the key in her hand, thought about the children, about Thomas and his frog, about Ruth Hadley and Clara, and the new windows that were solid and would hold weight. No, she said. A pause, longer than the first ones. I'd encourage you to think carefully, he said. I have thought carefully. She put the key in her bag. I've thought about nothing else since March. My answer is no. She walked past him. He let her go. That was the thing that frightened her most. He let her go without another word, because men like Arthur Pennington didn't chase. They maneuvered. They waited. They had more patience than she had options, and they knew it. She got half a block before her legs went unsteady under her, and she pressed one hand against the wall of the building beside her and breathed. Josephine. Vaughn was there. She didn't know how long he'd been close, but he was there 3 feet away, watching her with an expression that had none of his usual restraint in it, open and tight, and something close to anger, though it wasn't aimed at her. I saw him stop you, he said. I handled it. I know you did. He didn't move toward her, didn't crowd her, just stayed close enough to be present. What did he say? She told him. All of it, including the part about the money, which was the part she hadn't said out loud to anyone, and which cost her something to say now. When she finished, she looked at the street and not at him. So my father sold me, she said, flat, plain. And apparently, I wasn't worth more than Pennington's patience, because he came all this way, instead of just letting it go. Vaughn was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking that deliberate, unhurried processing. That was one of the things she'd come to trust about him, the fact that he never answered before he meant it. Can the document actually hold up? He said. I don't know. Maybe. I'm not a lawyer. I know a man in Cheyenne who is. She looked at him then. Vaughn. His name is Edgar Fitch. He handled my father's land deed when things got complicated in '74. He's good. He held her gaze. I can send a telegram today. This isn't your problem. You said that before. His voice was steady. I told you before that I know the difference between your problem and mine, and my choice to be involved in it. Are you going to let me send the telegram or not? She wanted to say no. The independence in her that had gotten her onto that train in the first place rose up and pushed at the word. But Clara's voice came back to her. Needing help and being capable aren't opposites. And she looked at Vaughn's face, which was honest and steady, and asking for nothing except the right to stand beside her, and she said, "Yes, send the telegram." Something released in his expression. Just slightly. All right. He sent it that afternoon. Pennington, for his part, was masterfully patient. He took his meals at the hotel, walked the street with the comfortable air of a man on an extended holiday, and spoke pleasantly to anyone who engaged him. By Thursday, he had charmed Harold Greer and made carefully neutral conversation with 3 members of the school board's wives, and Josephine, watching this from a distance, felt the ground under her shift in a way that had nothing to do with the floors of the schoolhouse. He wasn't threatening her. He was making himself at home. He was making himself look like the reasonable party. "He's been telling people the story," Clara said on Thursday evening, her voice low and careful. "His version of it. A concerned family friend come all this way to make sure a young woman who'd made a hasty decision was all right. Nothing heavy-handed, just concern. And people believe him. People believe a well-dressed man with a hotel room and a Boston address," Clara said, direct as always. "That's human nature, Josephine. It's not fair, and it's real." She went home that night and sat at her writing desk and looked at the blank paper in front of her for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had been a practical woman with an impractical heart, and who had loved her husband in spite of everything. The way you love the place you grew up, not because it deserves it entirely, but because it's yours. She thought about what her mother would say if she were in this room. She thought she probably knew. Choose, her mother had said once when she was 16, and asking about a different, smaller thing. Just make sure it's yours to choose. She was still sitting there when she heard the knock. Not Clara's 3-part rhythm. Something harder. She went down. Vaughn was on her step. His hat was in his hand, and his jaw was at that angle, and behind him the street was dark and empty. "Edgar Fitch wired back," he said. She stepped back. He came in and stood in the narrow hall because there was nowhere else to stand, and he was close enough that she could see the thing he was holding carefully behind his expression. "Tell me," she said. "The document your father signed is real. It's a betrothal contract valid under certain interpretations of Massachusetts law." He paused. "But Fitch says it's not automatically enforceable in Wyoming territory. Territorial law's different. It would take Pennington filing action in a territorial court, and he'd need to establish—" He stopped. "He'd need to establish that you have no established life here, no real ties, nothing that argues against return." She heard what he wasn't saying before he said it. "He'd need to show I'm not really settled," she said slowly. "Yes. That I'm just temporary, passing through. That's what Fitch said." She was quiet. Outside, a dog barked twice and went still. The lamp on the hall table made everything amber and close. "I have a contract with the school board," she said. "Pennington's been talking to Harold Greer." Her head came up. "I don't know what was said." Vaughn told her, his voice controlled, and even in the way it got when he was working to keep it there. "Greer wouldn't meet my eye this afternoon. That's not nothing. He's going to try to have me dismissed." She said it out loud to hear whether it was real. It was. "If I have no employment here, if there's no contract, then Pennington can argue I have no established ties." She pressed one hand flat against the wall. "He's not just waiting. He's been dismantling." "I know. He's been in town 5 days, and he's already—" She stopped, drew breath. "He's very good at this." "He is." Vaughn held her gaze. "So are you." She looked at him. In the amber light he looked like something certain, and she was so tired of uncertain things, so tired of ground that shifted and men who maneuvered and loved that turned into transaction without you noticing until the papers were already signed. "What do I do?" she said. She wasn't asking him to decide for her. She was asking for a voice in the room that wasn't her father's, wasn't Pennington's, wasn't every man who'd ever looked at her life and seen a column in a ledger. Fitch said. Vaughn stopped, started again. He said Pennington's argument fails if you can demonstrate real ties. Employment, yes, but also a pause. Waited. Community standing. People who'd testify to your presence here, your place here. He looked at her steadily. And if there were other circumstances that established your life here as permanent. The hall was very quiet. Other circumstances, she said carefully. He looked at her with his whole face open in a way she'd never seen it. No professional distance, no careful, almost smile, just Vaughn Daniels, standing in her hallway in the dark, telling her the truth. I'm not asking because of Pennington, he said. I need you to understand that first. I was going to ask, I'd been trying to figure out how to ask before he ever stepped off that train. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular. Vaughn, I know what I'm saying, he said. And I know it's not a small thing to say. I know you came here for your independence, and I know the last thing you need is another man making decisions about your future. His jaw worked. So I'm not making a decision, I'm asking a question. She stared at him. Josephine Callaway, he said, would you let me court you? Properly. With your full say in every part of it, and the understanding that, he stopped, that I would rather have you tell me no, and know it was your choice, than have you say yes to something you didn't want, because a man from Boston gave you no other option. The lamp flickered. She thought about Boston and the dining room table, and her father's hand on her back, steering her toward a man she didn't choose. She thought about the train and the letter in her bodice and the promise she'd made to herself. She thought about new windows that held weight and a child presenting frog biology with the gravity of a tiny scholar and dancing in a barn while the fiddles played and the stars came out and a hand that found hers without taking anything. Yes, she said. He exhaled just once, just slightly, like a man who'd been holding something for a long time. Then he reached up slowly, and with a care that undid something in her chest entirely, he touched her face. Just his hand against her jaw, his thumb below her cheekbone tilted toward him, like she was something he wanted to look at properly. I'm going to kiss you, he said, if that's all right. Nobody had ever asked her that before. She realized, standing in that hallway, that no one had ever asked her anything. Yes, she said for the second time in 2 minutes, and meant it twice as much. He kissed her. Not stolen, not rushed. Not the careless assumed thing she'd been braced for her whole life. It was deliberate and gentle and entirely his, and she felt it in every part of herself she'd locked down and managed and held controlled for 20 years, and when he pulled back and looked at her, his hand still against her face, her hands had found the front of his shirt, without her deciding to put them there. All right, he said quietly. Yes, she said for the third time, because it was the only word she had. He was at the door when he stopped, turned back. In the morning, he said, I'm going to talk to Harold Greer. She looked at him. Vaughn. He's a reasonable man under the nonsense. His voice was steady. And he saw what you did for Thomas. That means something whether he's admitted it or not. She nodded once. He left. She stood in the hallway for a long time after his footsteps faded, one hand pressed against her mouth. Not because she was trying to hold something in, but because she was trying to hold something real. Pennington ate his breakfast at the hotel the next morning, pleasant and patient as ever. He did not know that Edgar Fitch in Cheyenne was already preparing a counterfiling. He did not know that Clara Holt had spent Thursday evening making 14 visits to 14 households. And he did not know that Harold Greer, who had a 10-year-old son who delivered the best 2-minute presentation on frog biology his school teacher had ever witnessed, was sitting at his desk first thing Friday morning, trying to decide what kind of man he actually wanted to be. Arthur Pennington had come a long way, but he'd made the critical mistake that men like him always made. He'd assumed that because Josephine Callaway had come to Laram alone, she was still alone. He was wrong. Harold Greer kept Vaughn waiting 20 minutes before he opened his office door. That was deliberate. Vaughn knew it was deliberate, and he stood in the grain and leather smell of the front room, and let the 20 minutes pass without checking his watch once because he understood men like Harold Greer. The way he understood difficult horses' pressure made them dig in, and patience made them curious. When Greer finally opened the door, he looked like a man who hadn't slept well. Good, Vaughn thought. That meant his conscience was still operational. Vaughn, Greer said, too casual. Harold. Vaughn came in and sat down without being invited, which was also deliberate. I want to talk about Miss Callaway's contract. Greer settled behind his desk and picked up a pen he didn't need. Her employment's a school board matter. You're not on the school board. No, but I'm a taxpayer in this county, and I've got 3 neighbors with children in that schoolhouse, and I've got eyes. Vaughn kept his voice level. What did Pennington say to you? A pause. He was very cordial, Greer said carefully. I didn't ask how he was. I asked what he said. Greer set down the pen, picked it up again. He expressed concern about the situation. He indicated that Miss Callaway had left Boston under circumstances that reflected poorly on her judgment. That she was young. Perhaps not as settled as one might hope for someone responsible for Harold. Vaughn stopped him. Quiet. Direct. Thomas came home on Wednesday and spent 40 minutes at the dinner table telling his mother everything he'd learned that day. His mother told my neighbor Margaret. Margaret told me. He held Greer's gaze. When is the last time Thomas Greer spent 40 minutes at the dinner table talking about school? A long silence. She's good, Greer admitted finally, and it came out like something he'd been holding back. She's exceptional, Vaughn said. And she's here because she wants to be, not because she had nowhere else to go. She chose Laram. She chose those children. He leaned forward slightly. What Pennington wants from her is not your business, and not the school board's business. Her contract is. You going to honor it? Greer looked at the desk. He suggested that her personal situation might create distractions. Her personal situation is that a man she never agreed to marry followed her across the country because he considers her a debt his money is owed. Vaughn's voice stayed even with effort. That's not her failing. That's his. The silence this time was different, the kind that meant a man was doing the actual arithmetic of who he wanted to be. The board meets Monday, Greer said finally. I'll be there. Vaughn stood, picked up his hat, and was at the door when Greer said his name. Vaughn. He turned. Greer was looking at him with something unguarded in his face. She really got Thomas to sit down for dinner. 40 minutes, Vaughn said. About frogs. Greer almost smiled. It was enough. Josephine found out about the board meeting from Ruth Hadley, who found out from Margaret, who had it from Vaughn, which meant the information had traveled through 3 people before breakfast and arrived at her door by the time she was locking the schoolhouse at noon. He went to Greer this morning, Ruth said. I know. She'd figured it out the moment she woke up. Did anyone go with him? Clara's been busy, Ruth said with a particular smile. She visited with Margaret Hollis last night, and Margaret's married to one of the board members. And she spent this morning at the Hadley house, where she apparently had a very long conversation with me about the quality of instruction Thomas Greer has received this fall. The smile settled into something solid. Not everyone in this town is going to roll over for a Boston suit. Josephine felt something loosen in her chest. Ruth. Don't you thank me, Ruth said, firm and fond in equal measure. Just keep teaching. But the loosening tightened again that afternoon. She was at the dry goods store second time this week because she'd run out of chalk at a rate that suggested she was actually teaching instead of just presiding over a room of children, when the bell above the door sounded and she looked up and found Arthur Pennington 3 feet away. He was alone. He'd timed it, she understood that immediately. He'd waited until she was somewhere small and enclosed with no one close enough to overhear. I've been hoping to speak with you again, he said pleasantly. I believe I said everything I had to say. You did. He stepped to the counter beside her, examined a jar of hard candy with complete serenity. I want to tell you something, Josephine, without the framing of the legal document, man to person. He glanced at her. I'm not unkind. I think you know that. I know you're not obviously unkind, she said. That's not the same thing. He considered that. Fair. But I want you to think carefully about what you're choosing. Daniels is a rancher. The land out here is brutal. You've had one good summer. You haven't seen what this place does to people in 5 years, 10 years. The work, the isolation, the loss. He paused. You have an alternative that is comfortable, established, and civilized. I'm asking you to weigh that honestly. She looked at the jar of candy and thought about what he was actually doing, which was the thing she'd always been able to see through, even when she wished she couldn't. He wasn't appealing to her reason. He was appealing to her fear. He was betting on the part of her that was still 20 years old and not entirely sure she was strong enough for the life she'd chosen. She turned and faced him directly. Mr. Pennington, she said, I have thought about the work. I have thought about the isolation and the winters I haven't seen yet, and everything this place could cost me. She held his gaze. And I am still here, ill. So I'd ask you to consider what that tells you about my answer, and stop spending your time on a conversation that's already been settled. He looked at her. The pleasantness in his expression was still there, but something behind it had shifted, a calculation recalibrating. Edgar Fitch, he said. She kept her face still. Good attorney, Pennington said. We've been in the same courtroom before. He tucked his thumbs into his vest. Tell Daniels his man is good, but so is mine. He walked out. She stood at the counter until her hands stopped wanting to shake, bought her chalk, and went back to the schoolhouse. She was not afraid. She was afraid. Both things were true, and she'd learned a long time ago that being afraid and being decided were not mutually exclusive. She pressed one hand against her sternum, breathed, and then opened her lesson plan for Monday and started working. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later, which was earlier than usual, and sat on his desk and looked at her. My daddy came home for lunch today, he said. He and my mama talked in the kitchen for a long time. She kept writing. People do that. He came out looking like he'd figured something out. Thomas swung his legs. He gets like that when he's been wrong about something and he's decided to fix it. A pause. Is the man from Boston trying to make you leave? She looked up. 10 years old. She'd stopped being surprised by him, but she hadn't stopped being moved by him. He's trying, she said honestly. Thomas absorbed that with his characteristic gravity. Professor Greenback and I would prefer if you stayed. She felt it hit somewhere right behind her ribs. I would prefer that too, she said. Very much. He nodded once satisfied and went to check on the frog. The school board met on Monday evening in the back room of Greer's feed store. Josephine did not attend. Vaughn had told her he'd be there. Clara had told her she'd be there, and Ruth had told her she'd be there with or without an invitation, which Josephine believed completely. She sat in her room above Caldwell's and did not pace, which took considerable self-discipline. At 8:30 she heard boots on the stairs. 2 knocks deliberate. She opened the door. Vaughn's face told her before he said a word. It was open in the way it had been in the hallway, none of the careful distance, all of him present and readable. Contract stands, he said. She let out a breath that had been living in her chest since Friday morning. Greer made the motion himself, Vaughn said. He came in and stood in the narrow hall the way he had before, careful of the space, careful of her, but solid in the way of something you could lean against if you needed to. Clara spoke. Ruth spoke. Margaret Hollis's husband spoke, which I gather surprised everyone, including Margaret Hollis. Something crossed his face that was close to humor. And Thomas Greer apparently made his opinion known to his father in terms that were direct. He's 10. He's also Harold Greer's son. Vaughn's voice softened. You did that. Whatever you built in that boy this fall, you did that. She pressed her lips together. Did not cry. She'd cried enough for one lifetime of other people's decisions. These were her own choices, and they were holding, and she was not going to cry about things holding. "Pennington," she said. Vaughn's expression changed. "Fitch sent another wire this afternoon. Pennington's lawyer has filed in territorial court." He paused. "There'll be a hearing, probably within the month." "What does Fitch say about our chances?" He looked at her honest, as he always was. "He says the contract is questionable, but not nothing. He says the key is demonstrating establishment of life here. Employment community standing permanence." He paused. He said the strongest argument would be change in circumstances. She heard the weight of that. "He means marriage," she said. "Yes." The hall was very quiet again. The lamp was lit. His hat was in his hand. "Vaughn," she said carefully, "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it." "All right. I will not marry you to win a legal argument." She met his eyes. "I will not have it be that. If I ever choose, that it'll be because it's mine to choose, not because Arthur Pennington forced my hand. Do you understand what I'm saying?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I understand exactly what you're saying." "Good. I also want you to know," he said, just as steady, "that I would wait, however long it takes, whatever Pennington does or doesn't do." His jaw was at that angle. "My answer doesn't change based on a courtroom schedule." She looked at him. She thought about the first day on the platform, and the soft floorboards, and the harvest social, and the dance, and the hallway, and his hand against her face. "I know," she said quietly. "That's the thing about you, that I—" She stopped, started again. "It's not nothing. You knowing I know." "No," he said. "It isn't." He left, and she stood there and thought about permanence, what it meant, what it cost, what it was worth building slowly and exactly right. The telegram arrived on Wednesday morning. It was addressed to her, which meant it had come directly not through Vaughn, not through Clara. The station master's boy brought it to the schoolhouse during morning lessons and handed it through the window with the solemn expression of a child performing an important duty. Josephine held it in both hands for the time it took Thomas Greer to conjugate 3 verbs correctly, and then she told the class to copy the arithmetic from the board and turned the telegram over. It was from her father. Not long. He was not a long man when it came to words that cost him something. "Pennington has filed. I am aware you have engaged counsel. I want you to know I did not expect him to follow you. The money has been returned. The arrangement is dissolved on my end. What Pennington does from here is his own business and beyond my control. Your mother would not have wanted this. Neither I think do I." "Father." She read it 3 times. Then she sat down at her desk. Actually sat, which she didn't do during lessons, and the class went very quiet the way children do when they sense an adult has encountered something large. Thomas watched her from his desk. He didn't say anything. He was getting better at that. She looked at the telegram again. Your mother would not have wanted this. Her mother who had been practical and impractical in equal measure. Her mother who had said choose and make sure it's yours to choose. Her father had never been a tender man. This was as close to an apology as he was capable of, and she understood that. And she let herself feel what that was, not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever exactly, but something more complicated, something real. She folded the telegram and put it in her pocket. Arithmetic, she said clearly. Thomas Greer, you're doing them in your head again instead of showing your work. Show your work. Thomas showed his work. She found Vaughn at the schoolhouse after school let out. He'd come to check the stovepipe, which had been showing signs of temperament as the weather turned, and she handed him the telegram without preamble. He read it. She watched his face. The money's returned, he said. The arrangement's dissolved. On his end, Pennington still filed. Vaughn looked at the telegram one more time and handed it back. Pennington still got his pride, he said, and probably his lawyer's retainer already paid. Edgar Fitch's position. Better. He looked up at the stovepipe, pressed something into place with practiced ease. Without your father's backing, Pennington's filing is significantly weaker. He'd have to argue the contract on its own merit without the family cooperation that made it look legitimate. He glanced at her. Fitch thinks we can have it dismissed. The word we landed quietly between them. She'd noticed when he'd started doing that, not taking over, not assuming, just placing himself alongside her so naturally that it stopped feeling presumptuous and started feeling like the truth of the situation. I wrote back to my father, she said. Vaughn waited. I told him I received his telegram and that I understood it for what it was. She paused. I didn't say I was all right. I didn't reassure him. But I didn't close the door. He nodded, slowly. That sounds like the right amount of grace. I wasn't sure if it was enough. For him or for you? She thought about it. Me, I suppose. I wasn't sure if I was being cowardly or generous. Vaughn climbed down from the stool he'd been using and looked at her with that direct, steady gaze. Your father did a wrong thing. He's acknowledged it in the way a man like him can. You left a door open. He paused. That's not cowardice. That's just choosing what you want to carry. She looked at him. How do you do that? What? Say the exact right thing. Without? She made a small gesture. Without making it about being right. He considered that seriously. I just say what's true, he said. The rest takes care of itself mostly. She smiled. Actually smiled, which she hadn't expected to do today of all days. He reached up and touched her jaw, that same careful gesture from the hallway, and she turned her face into it slightly without deciding to. We're going to be all right, he said. You don't know that. No. His thumb moved once just below her cheekbone. But I know that I'm not going anywhere, and I know you're not going anywhere, and from where I'm standing, that's the foundation you build on. She put her hand over his, held it there. Stay for supper, she said. Clara's been feeding me enough for 3 people. Something in him relaxed. She felt it through his hand. Clara Holt believes food is a form of problem-solving. She's not wrong. He laughed, and she felt the sound of it the same way she'd felt it the first time in the schoolhouse, like something that surprised him on the way out, brief and real and entirely unmanufactured. She was going to be all right. They both were. But the hearing was still coming, and Arthur Pennington was still at the hotel, and on Thursday morning, Josephine walked past the hotel and saw him at the window table, through the glass coffee cup, raised, watching her cross the street, with the patient, pleasant expression of a man who had not yet decided to give up. Their eyes met through the glass. She kept walking. Head straight pace, even 20 years of practice in her spine. But when she got to the corner and turned, and he could no longer see her, she stopped and pressed one hand against the building and let herself feel what she actually felt, which was afraid and decided. And something else underneath both of those. Something that hadn't been there before Laram. Something that felt, she realized, like the specific weight of having something real to lose. She had a life here. An actual one with 32 names she knew by heart, and a frog named Professor Greenback, and a woman who brought her food, and a man who said, "We like it," cost him nothing. She had built this. With her own hands and her own choices in the 5 months since she'd stepped off a train in the summer heat and stood on a platform holding a letter like a map to buried treasure. She was not going to lose it. She walked to the schoolhouse with that certainty in her chest, solid as the windows Vaughn had built, that would hold weight if you pressed against them. The children were already waiting on the step. Thomas looked at her face when she arrived and said with the directness of a boy who'd learned it was respected, "Good morning, Miss Callaway. You look like yourself today." She looked at him. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said, in a voice that was almost exactly Vaughn's. He had no idea he'd done it. She felt the laughter come up before she could stop it, real and unguarded, right there on the schoolhouse step, with 32 children watching their teacher laugh in the morning sun. "Inside," she said when she had herself back. "All of you." They went. She followed, and in the back of her mind, very quiet and very certain, a decision was finishing the process of making itself, not because of Pennington, not because of a courtroom calendar, not because of anything except the 32 names she knew by heart, and the man who said we and the life she had built from nothing but her own stubborn, unshakable will. She just needed one more thing to be sure. And she suspected she already was. She told Vaughn on a Friday morning before school started, while the stove in the schoolhouse was still warming, and Professor Greenback was regarding them both from his jar with his usual philosophical indifference. She told him simply the way she'd decided to, no lead-up, no softening, no careful arrangement of words designed to land gently. She'd spent enough of her life arranging herself for other people's comfort. "I want to marry you," she said. "Not because of the hearing, not because of Pennington, because I wake up every morning and the first thing I think about is the life I'm building here. And you are in every part of that thought, and I am 20 years old, and I know my own mind, and I am telling you what it says." Vaughn looked at her. The stove ticked. Outside, a wagon rolled past on Main Street. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right. I told you my answer doesn't change." Something moved in his face, that thing that was more than the almost smile now that she had a full name for finally. "I meant it." "You're not going to say anything else. I'm going to say—" He crossed to her unhurried the way he did everything and took both her hands in his. "That you are the most deliberate person I have ever met in my life, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment, and I would be honored to spend the rest of mine watching you be exactly that." She felt it move through her, not the giddy, untethered feeling she'd always imagined love would be, but something more serious and more solid. Something that felt like ground under her feet. "We should tell Clara," she said, "before she finds out from someone else and feels left out of it." He laughed. "She probably already knows." "She absolutely already knows," Josephine agreed. She was right. Clara opened her door that afternoon, looked at their faces for approximately 1 second, and said, "Finally," with the satisfaction of a woman whose patience had been tested but had ultimately proved correct. Then she burst into tears, which neither of them had expected, and which she waved away immediately with her apron, while simultaneously reaching for them both. "Don't look at me," Clara said thickly. "I'm not sentimental." "Of course not," Vaughn said with complete seriousness. "Not even slightly," Josephine agreed and put her arm around her. The hearing was set for the second week of November in the Territorial Courthouse in Cheyenne. Edgar Fitch sent word on Monday, 3 pages of careful legal language that translated in Vaughn's plain summary to this, with the betrothal contract undermined by her father's withdrawal of consent, and the dissolution of the financial arrangement. Pennington's case rested almost entirely on challenging Josephine's established residency in Wyoming territory. Their job was to demonstrate that she was not a temporary presence. "He's going to argue you're unsettled," Fitch wrote. "We are going to demonstrate the opposite." What Josephine hadn't anticipated was what that demonstration would look like in practice. On Tuesday morning, she arrived at the schoolhouse to find a handwritten letter on her desk. It was from Margaret Hollis, whose husband sat on the school board. It was 3 paragraphs long and offered in careful and somewhat formal language to testify at the hearing on Josephine's behalf regarding her character and her contributions to the community of Laram. On Wednesday, there were 2 more letters. One from Ruth Hadley. One from a rancher named Bill Coates, whose daughter Josephine had kept an extra half hour on Thursday afternoons to help with reading because the girl was behind and embarrassed about it, and making up ground faster than anyone would have guessed. On Thursday, there were 7. On Friday morning, when Josephine came in and found the stack, she sat at her desk with her hands flat on them and couldn't speak for a moment. Thomas, who arrived early as he usually did, now watched her from across the room. "My daddy wrote one too," he said. "He made me spell check it." She looked up at him. "He kept writing extraordinary," Thomas said. "I told him there's no O in it. He wrote it 3 more times." He paused. He got it right on the 4th. She pressed both hands over her mouth, held it together barely. "Miss Callaway," Thomas said, "Professor Greenback has learned to recognize me. He comes to the front of the jar when I walk in." "Does he?" she managed. "I think that means something." "I think it does too." He nodded satisfied and went to greet his frog, and Josephine turned to the blackboard and wrote the day's lessons with a hand that was entirely steady. Arthur Pennington came to her on Saturday. Not to the store this time. He knocked on the door of her room above Caldwell's in the early afternoon, when the street was quiet, and when she opened the door, he was standing there without his coat. For once, hat in his hands, and something in his face that was different from anything she'd seen in it before. He looked tired, not the performance of weariness, actually tired. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "No documents, no lawyers. Just speak." She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. He stood in the center of her small room and looked around it. The writing desk, the narrow bed, the stack of lesson plans, the single window with its view of Main Street, and she watched him take it in. "This is your life," he said. "Yes." He turned to face her. "I received your father's letter. The formal withdrawal." He paused. "I was not surprised. I was—" He stopped, started again. "I was angry at first. Then I was something else which took me longer to identify." She waited. "I was relieved," he said. She hadn't expected that. "I am 60 years old, Josephine." He held her gaze with something that was for the first time entirely without strategy. "I am 60 years old, and I have been in business with your father for 11 years, and somewhere in those 11 years, I convinced myself that what I wanted was a wife, a companion, an arrangement that would benefit both parties." He looked at the window. "I told myself you were a reasonable choice. Good family, good sense, well-bred." A pause. "I told myself a great many things that had very little to do with what you actually wanted." The room was quiet. "I'm withdrawing the filing," he said. "I'm instructing my lawyer in Cheyenne today." She stared at him. "I came to Wyoming," he said slowly, "because I believe very strongly in honoring agreements, because your father and I made one, and I take those seriously." He looked at his hat in his hands. "But I sat in this town for 2 weeks, and I watched you, and I saw what you've built here, and I saw how this town looks at you, and I saw—" He stopped. Something moved through his face. "I saw Daniel's look at you." She felt heat climb her throat. "And I understood," Pennington said quietly, "that I had never looked at anyone that way in my life, and that you deserve someone who does." He put his hat back on, precise and deliberate. "I am not the villain of your story, Josephine. I need you to know that." "I know," she said. "I also know that what you did was wrong." He nodded, accepting it. "Yes, it was." "And that I forgive it," she said. "Not for you, for me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother raised you well." "She did." He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "The man from Boston who showed up is going home," he said. "What happens next in Laram is none of his business." He left. She stood in the center of her room and breathed. Then she put on her coat and went to find Vaughn. She found him at the Double D, where she'd been twice before, once to see where he lived, and once because Clara had sent her with a message, and then admitted later she'd invented the message entirely. The ranch was everything she'd expected from a man like Vaughn. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. Everything built to last. He was in the corral working with a young horse when she arrived. He saw her face over the rail and came immediately the way he always came when something was in her expression, direct and unhurried and completely present. "Pennington's withdrawing," she said. "He told me himself. He's instructing his lawyer today." Vaughn went still. "It's over," she said. "The filing, the legal threat. He's going home." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached through the corral rail and took her hand, and she gripped it back, and they stood there, while the fact of it settled around them like weather changing. "You all right?" he said. "I'm more than all right." She looked up at him. "I'm done waiting. I want to get married before the first hard snow." He blinked. "The first hard snow might be 3 weeks away. Then we'd better move quickly." His jaw went to the thinking angle. Then the almost smile came, and then the real thing, the brief, unguarded laugh that she would spend the rest of her life collecting because it never lost its effect on her. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, which was so unlike him in its formality and so entirely him in its care that she felt it everywhere. 3 weeks, he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. They married on a Saturday in late November in the church on 2nd Street, with the first frost of the season on the ground outside and every pew full. Clara cried through the entire ceremony openly this time, without apology or apron, with Ruth Hadley patting her arm and maintaining her own composure with visible effort. Harold Greer sat in the 3rd row with his wife and Thomas, who had been given the responsibility of holding the church door, and took it with a gravity that would have been comical if it hadn't also been completely sincere. Josephine wore her blue dress, the same one she'd worn to the harvest social, because she'd earned every association it carried, and she carried wildflowers that Clara had somehow found dried and preserved from the summer, tied with a ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She'd written to her father, told him the date, the place, the name. She hadn't asked him to come. She hadn't told him not to. She'd left the door exactly the width she'd decided it should be, and trusted him to understand that. He hadn't come. He'd sent a letter that arrived the week before, and it said 2 things: that he wished her well, and that her mother's wedding ring was at the bank in Boston whenever she wanted to claim it. She'd written back, "Thank you. I will. Not forgiveness, whole and complete. Not yet, but the door." When the preacher asked if anyone present had objection, Thomas Greer said clearly from his post at the church door, "No, sir, nobody does." And the congregation laughed, and Harold Greer looked at his son with an expression that was half mortified and entirely helpless and completely proud, and Josephine caught Vaughn's eye, and something passed between them that had no name but was worth more than anything she'd been offered in her father's dining room. "I do," she said when it was time, and felt the words settle into her bones like something that had always been true and was finally being said out loud. "I do," said Vaughn, and looked at her the way Pennington had described, and she would have recognized it anywhere. They walked out of the church into cold November air, and the sound of everyone they'd built a life among, and Josephine stood on the church step and felt the weight of the last year press itself flat, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer a load she was carrying, just a foundation, the kind you build on. "Cold," Vaughn said, putting his coat around her shoulders. "I know something about hard winters," she said. He looked at her sidelong, and the almost smile became everything else, and she put her hand in his. 3 months later, on a morning in February, when the Wyoming wind was doing exactly what everyone had told her it would, and she was discovering she was exactly strong enough to withstand it, she sat at the writing desk in the room they shared at the Double D and looked at the calendar on the wall. Then she looked at it again. She pressed both hands flat on the desk, breathed. Then she got up and found Vaughn in the barn where he was feeding the horses in the particular focused quiet of a man who starts his mornings doing useful work before the world asks anything of him. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. He saw her face. He went still. "Vaughn," she said. He crossed to her. Not hurried, but with that quality of total attention she'd catalogued and counted and loved since a dusty platform in July when she'd been a woman with a carpetbag and a promise and nothing else. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He stood in front of her for one long still moment, and then he put both arms around her and held her against his chest, not the careful, respectful distance he'd always given her, but the hold of a man who understood that she was choosing to be held and was holding her like it mattered that she'd chosen it. She felt his heart against her cheek, fast and steady and entirely real. "All right," he said into her hair. His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard before. "All right." "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true." She laughed, pressed against his chest, and he held her tighter, and outside the Wyoming wind ran hard against the walls of the barn and found nothing to get through because everything had been built right. She thought about the girl who'd burned her father's letter and boarded a train with nothing but a promise she'd made to herself. She thought about the platform in the summer heat and the soft floors she'd found on her knees and the windows rebuilt solid and Clara's three-knock rhythm and Thomas Greer conjugating verbs with the gravity of a tiny scholar and a harvest social and a dance and a hallway and a lamp and a hand against her face and a question no one had ever thought to ask her before. She thought about all the ways she'd been told what her life was supposed to look like and how none of them had looked anything like this cold February morning. This barn, this man, this life that was entirely, completely, irreversibly her own. She had come to Wyoming territory with a carpetbag and a promise. She had kept it.